Good afternoon. Thank you for your attention over the last 2 weeks. I want to take you back to the fall of 2006. Bryan Pata was a senior at the University of Miami. He had everything going for him. He was about to enter the NFL draft. The season was coming to a close. He switched positions. His draft stock was rising. One of the top agents had just called him. Everything was going Bryan Pata's way. He was about to make it to the NFL. His dream to buy his mom a house. Everything was just within reach. You heard that Bryan Pata was a car enthusiast, a gun enthusiast. He had a girlfriend, Jada. You heard from their roommate, Dwayne Hendricks. They had a little dog together. Now, on November 7th of 2006, that dream ended because of the jealousy of this man over here, the defendant, Rashaun Jones. So on the flip side of Bryan Pata, who had everything going for him at that time, we have Rashaun Jones, a star football player from Lake City, Florida. He comes to the University of Miami, where he's no longer the star. The competition level's higher, everyone's good. But here we are now in his junior year. It's now the fall of 2006. But in order to understand why Rashaun Jones would want to kill Bryan Pata, we have to go back to 2004 when the defendant started at the University of Miami. The defendant came in, like all the football players do, in the summer. Their practices, they all start, they get to know each other, and they live in the same dorms in the summer. So the first interaction they had that was not on the football field, that was not related to practice, you heard Eric Moncor and Dave Howell tell you about what happened. So one night, Eric and Bryan come back to Eric's dorm room, and they go to open the door. The door is locked. The door, these are suites connected by a bathroom. Both Eric's door and his roommate's door are locked. They leave them unlocked. And he's like, okay, no one opens the door. They go upstairs to their friend Dave Howell's room. Dave comes back down with them. And as they get to the hallway door, they can see through as they're going. They see the defendant coming out of Eric's room. They call out to him. They walk down the hall. He comes back, and now you saw the size of these guys. There are now Eric, Dave, Bryan, who's bigger than Eric and Dave, who you saw walk past you, and the defendant inside this single dorm room. There's not a lot of room. So Eric, Dave, Bryan, mainly Bryan, asking questions. Why are you here? What were you doing? Why were you in his room? Bryan is more protective of Eric's room than Eric. And this turns into a fight, a fist fight. When that fist fight ends, so Bryan hits Rashaun. This is Bryan, not Rashaun. Bryan hits Rashaun. Rashaun leaves. And what does Rashaun do? Rashaun brings a gun into this. Says,
Objection,
you better,
statement of the testimony.
You better clip up. What does clip up mean? You better go get your gun. This is not something that the players said to each other. This is not something people who are friendly say to each other. This is a threat. A threat to Bryan that you better go get your gun. Dave takes Bryan out of the dorms that night, and practice goes on. They all move on. Or so everyone else does. So now we go to later that fall, and Dave is in the dorms. And what does Dave see the defendant with? Dave Howell sees the defendant with a small caliber, black, snub-nosed revolver. Why does he remember this? He's never seen a gun before in his life. It's imprinted in his mind. He's now seen a gun. This is the first gun he's ever seen in person. This is why Dave remembers this. And these are things that don't become important until much later. So, in the fall of 2006, Rashaun can't get out of his own way. He's not a starter on the football team. He's not dating Jada Brody. He's tested positive for marijuana for the second time, which is a big deal when you are on a scholarship and subject to NCAA and the University of Miami rules. So second time, now you can't play for 2 games. If you test positive a third time, you're done. So Rashaun now is always in trouble for stupid little things. You heard from his teammates. Showing up late to study hall, showing up late to class, not keeping his grades up, testing positive for marijuana. It's always something with Rashaun. So on November 7th of 2006, the drug test results have come in, and Rashaun is brought into a meeting where you heard from Tony Hernandez. He's brought into a meeting and told, you just failed your second drug test, here's the letter, it's all official. You are suspended for the next 2 football games. You can't practice with the team and you're not playing. You heard from them that they still have access to the sports trainers, the weight room, so they can keep working out, but they are not on the football field with the rest of their teammates. Now Rashaun is down, it's 3 strikes and you're out. This is his second strike. This is not a good day for the defendant. So he goes home to lick his wounds, think about what he's going to do, and he goes back to his apartment. Now, when he goes back to his apartment, he changes his phone number. You've heard the testimony. He calls Verizon, or Sherry calls Verizon. Someone gets him this new phone number. You heard the defendant's own statement. Why did he get this phone number? He said because he didn't want to disappoint his mom, his grandmother, his family. He didn't want people calling him. His phone records are in evidence. Look at who he's calling. He gets this phone, and Sherry's number is highlighted in pink. Sergeant Cremasini marked who was making the phone call next to it. So, the defendant calls Sherry and dials *67 to block his number. That is at 4:11. Then, Sherry calls him back. Right after that, or an hour later at 5:07. So what we have is someone who doesn't want people to have his number, said this by his own words. First he's calling his girlfriend. First he's calling his girlfriend from a blocked number. That's not something you do. It's not on his phone records from the days before. And what do we know? He's given his phone number to his friend Bruce. Bruce is highlighted in blue here. So this first call is at 17:50 with Bruce, so 5:50. Then he talks to Sherry again at Pottery Barn at 5:57. Then we have Bruce. I want to look at these blue right here. He talks to Bruce a lot that day. Bruce is one of his best friends. He talks to Bruce at 6:34, and again at 6:41. And you can look at the columns, you can see how long they talked. 6:34. What's happening at this time? You heard from all these football players. Practice ends, they go to the showers, they change, They all head home. Bruce has called him, and what does the defendant know? He knows that practice is over, and whether Bruce specifically told him, he knows that Bryan Pata is on his way home from practice. He knows exactly what time he would be heading that way. So now, there are no phone calls between 6:41 and 7:39. The only people who could have the defendant's phone number at this time, he's changed his number, are the people that he's told. So, is he not getting a lot of calls during this time period? Yes. It's less than an hour. Now, you're going to go confront someone. You're going to go murder someone. I want to submit this question to you. Do you take your cell phone with you? If you do you turn your cell phone off? I'm showing you Stage 30. Detective Segovia showed you on a map where the defendant lives at Bermuda Village, and he shows you, where Bryan Pata lived at the Colony Apartments, where Bryan Pata was murdered. And the distance between these two locations on foot is about 1.2 miles, just over a mile. Rashaun Jones is a college football player. He is in shape. You heard from all the players, all these practices, twice a day that they had to go through. I submit to you, in that period of time, Rashaun Jones can easily run from his apartment to the defendant's, where he can be waiting in the shadows for Bryan Pata to come back from practice. We heard from the teammates. That day at practice, Rashaun's off sulking at home. The rest of the team on the football field practicing. The defense was beating up on the offense. You heard from Eric. Kareem had a hit. Bryan had a hit. He had a hit. They're in a great mood. It's their coach's birthday. It's Coach Hurt's birthday. They dumped the water cooler on him. It's a Tuesday practice, full pads. They're tired, upbeat, happy. This is how practice ends. They go to the locker room. Eric told you he's still sitting there just like exhausted. Everyone else is getting out of the showers. And that's the last time he talks to his friend Bryan. You heard from Bryan's roommate, Dwayne. Practice has ended. They're about to go their separate ways. Bryan says, I'll see you at the crib. He'll see him back at the house. He hears two freshmen call out and ask Bryan for a ride back to the dorms, which is on the way. And what do we know happens next? Bryan drives the freshman players back to the dorms. Dwayne drives home and stops for gas on the way. And Bryan speaks to his brother, calls his brother Fentanyl on the way home. Normal conversation. Talk about cars. Bryan is he's a car guy. He liked to buy old cars, fix them up, put fun colors, candy color paint on these cars, and then sell them. So he customizes the cars, makes them look pretty, sells them, makes a little money on the side. So he's talking to his brother Fed about their mutual love of cars, what color he should paint his car, what are they gonna do, and Fed, his brother Fentanyl, knows he gets home. Fentanyl told you that Bryan, as a car guy, installed aftermarket car accessories, aftermarket alarms, that Fentanyl thought that the delay on his car for the lights was set at a minute, so it's not a factory setting. It's an alarm, a specialty car alarm. Something that Dave also told you. Dave has now gone to another school, has transferred, but he knew how much his friend loved cars, and that he used to install fun alarms on his car, like something he called a kill switch. If someone took the car and the car would just shut off. Why this becomes important later when Paul Connor sees the lights on his car. So Bryan heads home, gets off the phone with his brother, gets out of the car. what happened next? We know that this is Bryan Pata's black Infiniti. He pulled into his parking place, he parks his car, he gets out of the car. He locks his car. The delayed lights don't start until he hits the button and locks his car. So Bryan walks around from the side of his car, down the path between his apartment building and the bushes, up towards his apartment. As he's walking, we know he got shot. How do we know he got shot there? Dr. Liu told you as soon as he was shot, he would have been incapacitated. He would have fallen to the ground. He couldn't do anything at that time. So this is where Bryan Pata landed. And if you look, you can see, I know it's hard to look at these photos, so I'm showing you what's been entered as State's Exhibit 14. I'm sorry, the last was State's Exhibit 3. You can see where his body was rolled over when he got medical treatment. You can see how he fell with his head on the pavement. And you can see his cell phone, his sidekick, and they called it the chirp, both his phones, as the other players told you, just out of his hands. And his keys right next to his hand. He was headed to his apartment when he was surprised by the defendant. His sidekick. His two phones. What happens next? So the defendant, who knew when practice was over, who got a phone call, so this isn't just a guess, got a phone call from his teammate, his good friend on the team, tells him that practice is over. He's now had time to go to Bryan Pata's apartment, where, as you see, Bryan's car with the Pata license plate is the car on the end. There's a dumpster there. The lights for the apartment stop over on the side by the wall, the entryway. And I submit to you, the defendant was there laying in wait to confront Bryan Pata when he got out of his car. Bryan, suspecting nothing, is walking up towards his apartment when he's shot in the head. What does the defendant do at that time? I'm showing you State's Exhibit 2 and 1. The defendant, you can see just inside this apartment how close Bryan's car was to the entry. The defendant turns and briskly leaves the apartment building. Unfortunately for him, as he exits, see there's a couple street lights right here, and you heard the testimony of Paul Connor. He passes right by Paul Connor, who was walking home from the Metro that day. Passes right by under the lights.
Objection, misstatement of the testimony.
Where he crosses path with Paul Connor, gives a slight smile. Paul Connor is about to go enter the apartment complex, turns his head, and sees the defendant start to take off. Not towards the car, starts to take off the path in the direction of his apartment. Paul Connor continues to walk into the apartment complex parking lot where Bryan Pata's car with a 48-second light delay, the lights are still on. This is why that timing is so important. Paul Connor, just before he sees the defendant, hears a pop like a cherry bomb. And then he sees the defendant. He sees him up close on the sidewalk just outside the apartment. So there's a pop, sees the defendant, walks inside, lights are on. There's no one else around. Paul Connor doesn't even notice that Bryan Pata is lying in the bush. But it makes sense. One person walks past you on the sidewalk. One person is face down on the sidewalk, hidden by a bush. Two things can be true. He can see the defendant and not see Bryan. Paul Connor is the first person there, the only person there. And Paul Connor doesn't know what he's seen, doesn't know the significance, and continues to walk to his apartment. He goes to his apartment, goes to bed for the night. In the morning, sees some police tape, some media, gets to work, turns on the news, and finds out that Bryan Pata's been murdered. Paul Connor puts two and two together and contacts the Miami-Dade Police Department, where he gives a full interview the day after the homicide of what he's seen. So all these area canvases, no one else comes forward, but Paul Connor comes forward immediately before they can even knock on his door and tells the police what he's seen because it's important. I'm showing you State's Exhibit 6. Now, you also heard Paul Connor testify that he was shown a lineup. And he got a good look at the defendant, and he picked him out of this lineup. He doesn't hesitate, he sees him, and he identifies the person that he saw that evening. Now, defense stood up here in opening and told you just 90%. That's true. This is a professor who did not believe in certainties. And I submit to you that's why he wrote 90%. These photos come from law enforcement databases. The police have to use the photos they have. They can't just go take a current photo of Rashaun with the exact facial hair and haircut that Paul Connor says he has. So he also says it's 90% because the facial hair is a little different than what he saw that day. Not the facial features, not the person, that the beard was a little different. Now, Bryan's roommate, Dwayne, who he referred to as Cat, was on his way home from practice too. He's a little behind Bryan. He stopped for gas, but he's not much behind Bryan. When he gets there, he calls 911. At the time, these were recorded on cassette tapes still by the Miami-Dade Police Department, the 911 dispatch operators. Bryan's girlfriend comes down the stairs. Dwayne is so distraught he can't even remember. He just knows that she must have been there, heard the call. His own voice, he doesn't remember making it. But it's his voice, his call. He pulls up. You can see in the crime scene photos that he doesn't even pull into his parking spot. I submit to you that's because Jada was downstairs screaming, and he gets out of his car, and they both find Bryan laying behind the bush. Everything can happen in a split second. So while they are there, while Dwayne is there, while Jada's there, they're calling the police. Police are starting to respond. Word is getting out to the University of Miami football players. Dwayne has called Bryan's family. The word is spreading. Word spreads fast. These are teammates. But you heard Juan Navarro testify that he was in a coaches meeting. So everything is just happening, one thing right after the other. Practice ends, coaches meeting. Coaches are still in that meeting. In that meeting, they're notified that Bryan Pata has been shot. And they start heading to the crime scene. So everything starts to get in motion for what is happening that night and how they're handling the situation. So 6:41 to 7:39. 7:40 p.m. Bruce Johnson calls the defendant to tell him he needs to come back to the Heck Center. Bruce, I want to remind you, Bruce is one of the defendant's best friends. They're calling their position groups, and this is how they notify everyone to come back. He told him he needed to come back. Okay, all right. Not, I'm not coming. I was kicked off the team. I don't want to be there. Nothing else like that. But they talk again 2 minutes later. They talk again 6 minutes after the first call. Again, 9 minutes after the first call. They're talking a lot. And right after Bruce has now told the defendant, and you heard it from Bruce's mouth, Bryan Pata has been either shot or murdered. I'm not sure what they knew right at that second. You need to get back here. Who does Rashaun call? He calls Sherry with *67, a blocked number. He calls her at 7:43. This is about 43 minutes after Bryan has been found by Dwayne and Jada. And you can listen to the 911 call and get that exact time of when they called the police. 43 minutes later, he talks to Sherry. Remember that, because I want you to think back to Sherry's testimony. Sherry was sitting up here saying she's frantic because she can't reach Rashaun. Where is he? Is he hurt? This is only minutes after the word is getting out to the football team. The word is getting out to the community that Bryan Pata's been murdered. Minutes later, minutes after a teammate gets a call. You think that the teammates are already calling Sherry? Use your common sense. It's not like they were called the second that Dwayne called the police. And he called from he blocked the phone number. Why would you call your girlfriend from a blocked number? Now, cell sites were not very prevalent back then. People didn't know exactly phone records. We weren't getting phone records for everything. You get call logs. If you looked at someone's cell phone, you wouldn't know who called them. If that's what you're thinking, not thinking phone companies keep records. Or maybe you do know that the phone companies keep records. You pull up your bill online and see who you called. But you think, if I block the call, no one's going to know. No one's going to know who I called. So that call between Sherry and the defendant is from a blocked number. And they don't talk again till 8:26. And then look at all of this later in the night. Two people who aren't talking, who are frantic, are talking continuously. The records speak for themselves. And in between, he's talking to Bruce again. But I think most importantly, Bruce knew that Rashaun had been suspended. This is one of his best friends, of course. I'm not going to be at practice. I've been suspended again. I messed up. And then he's calling him after practice. Called him about Bryan. Now he's calling him at 9:13 during the team meeting. Rashaun's the only one not there. Bruce tells you. It is undisputed. Everyone at that meeting tells you that the defendant was the only player not there. Some of them just noticed he wasn't there. Some of them, defendant can't say anyone else wasn't there. And Chief Hudak took the stand and told you that Rashaun, attendance had been taken, and Rashaun was the only one not there. The coaches noticed. So initially, you're noticing because from a coach perspective, we want to make sure all the players are accounted for. We want to make sure that they have counseling. We want to make sure they're safe. So the coaches do notice. This isn't just some random detail. And then the players notice. You sit with your position group. He wasn't there. So the coincidences start to build up. And that is something the police recognized from the beginning. So you heard from the officers in the case. As a homicide, the 911 call goes out, officers are dispatched to the scene. You heard from now Sergeant Perua, who was a new officer at the time. This was his first homicide. They're not a lot in Kendall, so they bring in all the training units. There were a lot of officers there. Not because of who was murdered, but just because as a training mechanism, they all respond. So he responds to the scene, he remembers the scene. And they treat this as they do every scene. You secure the scene, you secure the evidence, you separate the witnesses. Homicide responds. Homicide does area canvasses. They want to see if there's anyone who knows anything. They want to see if there's any video. They want to spread out. They want to look for casings. And they did. And there were no casings found at this scene. And what else does homicide want to do? They want to interview everyone while their memories are fresh. So Sergeant Hatz has told you he was new at homicide at the time, and he responded to the scene, and then he was told to respond to the HEC Center, the University of Miami Athletic Center, where the football players as well as other athletes train. So he goes there. Lieutenant Hellman told you he goes there, and their purpose is to interview players, start interviewing people that night, anyone with knowledge. Now, can they interview all 105 players on the team that night? No, they would have been there for days, especially just a couple of them. But Coach Kolker, in the meeting, anyone with anything thinks they may know anything, let's start with those players who might know something and bring them to this attention. So they start interviewing players. They coordinate to be able to go through the whole football team over the coming days and weeks. Now, while they're there, what happens? Once again, let's look at the phone records. Mike Sanders has a good friend on the football team, Khalil Jones. He was with him that night. They were on their way to dinner when his roommate, or friend, Khalil gets a phone call saying that Bryan was shot and they all need to go back to the HEC Center. So they go back to the HEC Center, Khalil goes to the meeting. Mike Sanders told you he was on the baseball team. He's an athlete, he's not a football player. So while he goes back to Khalil's apartment on the other side of campus, and he's watching news footage of what's happening. 22:04, 10:04, the defendant calls Mike Sanders. The other football players are at the HEC Center in a meeting, and the defendant chooses to call Mike Sanders asking him for money. Think about that timing. Mike doesn't remember him ever asking for money before. Also, Mike's sitting there, thinks this is strange, and what does he do? He thinks this is so strange that he immediately takes himself and goes to the HEC Center. There's a second call at 10:25. Mike doesn't remember making that call, but that's now Mike calling the defendant back. I submit to you that he's now at the HEC Center. He goes, he speaks to Coach Kolker. Coach Kolker says, oh, let's speak to the police. And then he speaks to Lieutenant Hellman. And he tells Lieutenant Hellman that he just...
That's not an evidence?
Oh. He speaks to Hellman, not Houses, right? Oh, yeah. Okay, sorry. Yeah, he speaks to Lieutenant Hellman. And Lieutenant Hellman sat here and told you that he spoke to Mike Sanders. So Mike Sanders immediately speaks to the coaches, speaks to the police, tells them that Rashaun, the defendant, has called him and asked for money. Money at a time shortly after Bryan Pata's death, while the rest of the players are all in a team meeting. Someone he has not asked for money before. And the records confirm this. And I'll come back to the defendant's statement, but think about what the defendant said to Detective Segovia. Mike Sanders, I barely remember Mike Sanders. It would be a lie if Mike Sanders said I called him asking for money. Mike Sanders went immediately after that phone call and reported it. Now, let's talk about Sherry Abramson, the defendant's girlfriend who cared about him so much she bought a car in his name, got a cell phone that afternoon registered to her house, and someone in 2007, the defendant didn't want to talk to the police without him being present. Now, think about this. Sherry was not a player. She was not friends with Bryan. Her connection to this investigation is the defendant. Sherry sat here and told you what she remembered from that night. The problem is, her phone records and Rashaun's phone records show she lied. They don't add up to what she told the police back in 2007, and they don't add up to what she told you here today. What did Sherry tell you? I just remind you what Sherry told you. Sherry told you that she was working at Pottery Barn. Okay, that part's consistent. There's a call from Pottery Barn. But as she's leaving work, she gets a call from one of the defendant's friends on the football team, Willie Cooper. Willie Cooper called her and said they were frantically looking for Rashaun and they couldn't reach them.
Objection. Facts not in evidence.
So let's look at that timing. And Sherry's records are in evidence too. She spoke to Rashaun at 7:43, right after Bruce made the phone call to come to the Heck Center. Right after Bruce told the defendant that Bryan Pata had been shot. How are all these people not able to reach him and are frantically calling in that short couple minute period of time? So she told you, she sits up here, she told you, she told the police, she's frantically calling coaches. And she does call a coach. She calls Coach Swayze.
Objection. Facts not in evidence. Mischaracterization of the evidence.
And she tells you that she calls Bruce's family, that she is just worried sick, but she's already spoken to him. She knew exactly where he was. She knew he was safe. So why is she so worried? Or why is she telling you that she's making all these phone calls and she doesn't know where he is? She also tells you she left Pottery Barn and she went back to Miami Beach where she lives. She got home sometime after 8:30, 8:39. That's consistent with her records. You heard from Sergeant Cremacini about the records on the beach. Now, what about Rashaun's records? She says that he came there shortly after too. And in his own statement, he says he went over to Sherry's right after, probably 8:39. He doesn't go to Miami Beach then. Also, if he's with Sherry, why are you calling someone so many times that you're with? I want you to think about that too. So these calls go into, he ends up, he's calling her 10:26, 10:34, 10:34, 10:34, 11:06, 11:15, 11:19, 11:41, 1:12, 1:14. When you're with someone, you're not calling them nonstop. Use your common sense. It doesn't add up. The statements, the evidence in front of you that doesn't add up comes from Sherry Abramson and the defendant's own mouth. What else did she tell tell the investigators? She told Detective Diaz that she was worried that the defendant was going to be blamed for this. Why is that her first thought? The defendant is going to be blamed for Bryan's murder. They were teammates. They weren't close, but so if they weren't close, and this isn't someone they really have issues with, why would you be blamed? Why would you be the one? This projectile came from Bryan Pata. Dr. Liu recovered this projectile, which George Hertel showed you, from Bryan Pata's head. George Hertel took the stand, and he told you how he had no weapon to match this to. If he did, he would be able to make a comparison. But what he was able to tell you about the possible weapons that fired this .38 caliber projectile, he told you in his opinion, his expert opinion, that it was from a revolver, likely, in his opinion, a .38. And there are a number of different firearms it could be, and a lot of them look the same. And why is it a .38 revolver? This is a lead projectile. It didn't have a jacket, it didn't have something on top. If this was fired from a semi-automatic firearm, it would leave residue over time. It would damage the gun. So this is the type of ammunition you buy for a revolver. The lands and grooves, and I think it's canulas, that are left on the projectile, the markings that are here, are consistent with that of a revolver. And he even showed you what one of the weapons would look like that matched these characteristics. Now think back to what Dave told you he saw in the defendant's own hands. That description, a short chamber, snub nose is what he called it, a black snub-nosed revolver. And he knew it was a revolver because he grew up watching Westerns with his brothers. He sees that gun in the dorms, and then later, years later, the defendant says, "Hey, big bro, I got a .38 on me." He's bragging about having a .38, which is consistent with what Dave Howell saw. And Kareem Brown was even confronted with, how did you know what he was talking about? He wears number 38. 38, and he has a .38. He knew because around the locker room, the defendant would brag about having a .38. So there was no mistake that he was talking about his firearm. Now let's go back to the defendant's statement. And you'll have a chance to take the evidence back and watch it. So the defendant told Detective Segovia that he had an up and down relationship with Bryan Pata, that it started with jealousy over females. So the main female there was Jada Brody, someone that the defendant had first dated and now was Bryan Pata's serious girlfriend. He told them that they had an altercation in the dorm, the altercation that you heard about from Dave Howell and Eric Moncourt. So altercation consistent. They had issues. They had issues over Jada. You heard from all the players on the team. What were the issues between them? They didn't like each other. Yes, they could play as teammates, but the underlying simmering issue was over girls, over a girl. The girl that Bryan had. Now, the defendant says he didn't own a gun. But this is something that's dating back to 2004, where he is threatening Bryan Pata to go clip up with a gun. He is then later showing Dave Howell a gun. And later after that, he's bragging about this .38 to Kareem. I submit to you, he had a gun. He had a gun in college, and the gun he had is the same one he used to kill Bryan Pata. He remembers November 7th. That makes sense. You'd remember one of the worst days of your life. You test positive, your future's unsure. You think that you're going to make this football career work, but you keep messing up. You don't have the girl. You're going to get kicked off the team. You can't play in games. You're already not starting. Things are not going your way. And then it all just boils over. And he made a mistake. But that mistake was fatal to Bryan Pata. The defendant tells you in his statement, tells Detective Segovia, that Bruce called after practice to say that Bryan was dead. That phone call that we have here at 6:34. Or sorry, I'm pointing the wrong one. Sorry, 7:40. 6:34 was when practice got over. He told him he had a mandatory meeting. So Rashaun tells you he knew he had this mandatory meeting, and then he spoke to Sherry. Guess what? It's consistent with his records, but it's not consistent with Sherry. And then he went to Sherry's house at 8:30 or 9. He didn't speak to anyone else other than Bruce or Sherry. The green. Do you remember the green that Sergeant Cremacini just highlighted? That's his home. The people he didn't want to disappoint. The people he told Detective Segovia he didn't want to have his number. And he told you that he barely remembers Mike Sanders. And that it would be a lie if he called him to ask him for money. Sherry had money. Sherry was already paying for things. But he called Mike Sanders. Detective Segovia also gave him an out. He asked him if he was in the area. Maybe he went for a run to clear his head. He wasn't at practice, and he just wanted to clear his head from the bad day he had. He told him no, he hadn't done that. He couldn't provide any reason why Paul Connor would have seen him. Right outside of where Brian's body was. The judge is going to read you some instructions at the end of closing. So one of these instructions is on eyewitness identification. So one of the things you consider is the capacity and opportunity of the witness to observe the offender based on the length of time, the conditions, lighting, and distance. These are two people who crossed each other on a sidewalk with streetlights. Whether the identification was the product of the eyewitness's own recollection or was the result of influence or suggestiveness. This is the second lineup Paul Connor was shown. The first lineup, he takes his time, looks at it and says, no, I don't recognize anyone. Second lineup, he gets to the defendant's picture and stops. He continues to look at the rest and then tells Detective Segovia and Detective Dominguez that that's the person he saw. Now, you're also taking into account the circumstances under which the defendant was presented to the eyewitness. Detective Segovia testified to that. Paul Connor was in his house and they presented him with the lineup. There are no inconsistent identifications. Any instance in which the eyewitness did not make an identification when given the opportunity to do so, that's referring to if he'd been shown multiple lineups with Rashaun's picture, with the defendant's picture. He was not. This is the only time. And the first time he immediately IDs him and he still remembers that years later. The witness's familiarity with the subject. You heard from Detective Segovia. He went and pulled Paul Connor's class schedule at the University of Miami. We looked at Rashaun's transcript to see exactly which professors he took. He did not take his class. This is not someone whose class he took. Rashaun Jones is not a starting football player. There are 100 players on the University of Miami football team. We have their names, their stats, their photos. There's no evidence that he knew who Rashaun was. He wasn't a starter. This isn't someone who was born and raised in Miami, where the University of Miami was their favorite football team. They have every single number memorized. This is someone from out of state who worked there for a couple years, didn't go to football games, sees them on TV, wearing, football players dressed in their helmets. This isn't the quarterback where the TV zooms in on them, mainly on the sidelines. Not a star player. This is not Bryan Pata. It's not Kareem Brown. Dwayne Hendricks. Not someone going the pros. This is not someone he knew. This is someone he recognized from crossing paths that night and stuck out in his memory, because that very next day, He realizes the importance of what he saw. So you can go through, and there are a couple others on here as well, whether the lapse of time, whether they're of different races, and the totality of the circumstances. You'll also be given the instruction for second-degree murder. So as we went over in jury selection, the state has elements that the state has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. One, Bryan Pata is dead. Dr. Liu testified and told you how he died. A single gunshot wound to the head incapacitated him, and he immediately fell there on the ground. The death was caused by the criminal act of Rashaun Jones. That criminal act is the act of pulling the trigger, of shooting him. 3, the third element, there was an unlawful killing of Bryan Pata by an act imminently dangerous to another and demonstrating a depraved mind without regard for human life. So what is a depraved mind? And what is an act that is imminently dangerous? So an act that is imminently dangerous to another and demonstrating a depraved mind is an act or a series of acts that a person of ordinary judgment would know is reasonably certain to kill. So I submit to you, pulling the trigger and shooting someone in the head is an act that's reasonably certain to kill them or do serious bodily injury, and is done from ill will, hatred, spite, or evil intent. So that ill will, hatred, spite, and evil intent had been boiling. It had been simmering under the surface for 2 years, over 2 years. And that act is of such a nature that the act itself indicates an indifference to human life. Shooting someone is an indifference to human life. But that ill will, hatred, spite, evil intent, that's what has been simmering under the surface. Bryan has everything that the defendant wants, and he chooses to let jealousy overtake him and kill Bryan Pata. We talked a little bit about puzzles. And how the state is going to prove everything together beyond a reasonable doubt. So you're also going to be read an instruction on reasonable doubt. Now, the judge will read this to you. It is proof beyond a reasonable doubt does not mean proof beyond all doubt. How do you have all doubt? If you see something with your own eyes. So, not proof beyond all doubt. A reasonable doubt, though, is not a mere possible doubt, a speculative, imaginary, or forced doubt. Could have, maybe was something different. That's not reasonable. That's not a reasonable doubt. So, such a doubt must not influence you to return a verdict of not guilty if you have an abiding conviction of guilt. Everything in this case adds up and points to the defendant. On the other hand, if after carefully considering, comparing, and weighing all the evidence, there is not an abiding conviction of guilt, or if having one, it's one which wavers and vacillates, it's not proof beyond every reasonable doubt, and you find the defendant not guilty because it's reasonable. So, a reasonable doubt is not any doubt. We don't have all doubt. So let's go back through those pieces of the puzzle that show the defendant's guilty. Starting in 2004, he threatens Bryan Pata and tells him to clip up. The issues, Bryan starts dating Jada. They were celebrating their 1-year anniversary the night before Bryan was killed. Now you heard that once Bryan is dating Jada, that she's the constant source of tension between them. This hadn't gone away.
Objection, this is characterization of the testimony, facts, not an evidence.
The issues they have with each other. They don't talk to each other. Anything that gets between them, the locker room knows. Their friends know. It's over Jada. All the players mentioned this. Everyone who testified, they knew this. And Dave told you he actually saw that. So Dave sees the fight in the dorm room, and then Dave sees another instance where Jada comes to tell Bryan something Rashaun's done, and they go at it and get into a fight. So that's later. This is ongoing. This is leading all the way up. And you heard that even in November, there were still, October, just before, this happens November 7th, that there are still issues between Rashaun and Bryan over Jada. So these haven't stopped. This isn't something far in the past. It's ongoing the whole time. The defendant had a gun. He had a .38 caliber gun, the same caliber that was used to kill Bryan. And a revolver doesn't leave casings, and there were no casings found at the scene. The defendant is the only one who wasn't at that meeting. And while he's at the meeting, he's calling Mike Sanders and asking for money. It's odd. He hadn't asked before. Defense stood up here in openings
Characterization of the testimony.
and told you that he's college broke. College broke, a girlfriend who pays for a cell phone, car, but he's on a full scholarship, athletic scholarship to University of Miami, room, board, tuition, girlfriend paying for extra stuff, and he's calling this other guy asking for money during the mandatory team meeting that he's the only one who's not there. And then you have his phone records. Take your time. Go through them. See why they don't add up. Why is he calling? Ask yourself, why is he calling his girlfriend from a blocked number? Why is his girlfriend calling him back and blocking her number? Why are there calls with Sherry when Sherry is frantically looking for him? Why is he not at her apartment when he says he's at her apartment and she says he's at his apartment? Why are they not concerned over his teammate who's been shot, but rather, oh, my future at the University of Miami? Yeah, you may start the day where that's the worst thing that happened to you, but now someone's dead. It's not a concern to them. And then, the last piece of the puzzle that he can't explain, Paul Connor sees him leaving the scene of the crime seconds. And we know it's seconds because we know that we had 48 seconds from the time that car was locked for this to happen, and Paul Connor sees him crossing paths after he's murdered Bryan and walks in and the lights are still on. So we know how close in time the defendant is to there. And he cannot explain why he's there.
Objection, burden shifting.
Detective Segovia asked him multiple times. Any reason? No? Okay. The defense wants you to believe that the defendant is the unluckiest person alive. That all the evidence in the case, the detectives interviewed over 150 witnesses. They speak to the entire football team. They speak to girlfriends. They speak to friends in the dorm. They speak to family members. They follow up on leads. They fly across the country. They're interviewing former teammates. They're following up on other leads. They're getting tips from psychics. They are following up on everything. And what happens? Every detail keeps coming back to the defendant. There is no statute of limitations for homicide. It is not a reasonable doubt if you say the defendant is guilty. He's the one who killed Bryan Pata, but he wasn't arrested for 15 years. That is not a reasonable doubt. That is not something that you can take into consideration. The question is, has the state proved the elements of the crime beyond a reasonable doubt? So if you are thinking of time, set that aside. That is not a reasonable doubt. Everything adds up to one individual, and that is the defendant. So at the end, you'll be provided with a verdict form. You should check the box. The defendant is guilty of second-degree murder. Then you must go down and answer some additional questions. Did the defendant actually possess a firearm in the course of committing the second-degree murder? You should answer yes. Did he discharge a firearm in the course of committing it? Yes. And did the discharge cause death? You should check the box yes. There is only one verdict that makes sense, and that is that the defendant, Rashaun Jones, is guilty of the homicide of Bryan Pata. Bye.